our next guests, and that is Karen Gohl and Lou Aronson, who have some very interesting data-driven analytics solutions. So we've started from integration, we've got to the data lake, and now what do you do with that? How do you solve business problems? And without necessarily incurring a massive multi-year, highly expensive engagement. In some cases, you're not exactly sure where your data is going or how they came to the conclusion that you're handed. So I'd like to start off by saying, can you each take a few minutes to describe your product in a kind of genesis from the problems higher ed was trying to address to what you've delivered today? And let's start with Curran.
Thanks, Mark. GetSet started, my co-founder and I started the company just with a problem, which was far too many students drop out. We really had no idea how to address this problem. We had a 2-year non-compete from selling our previous company in adaptive learning, so we couldn't do K-12. So we said, let's go to higher ed and solve what we think is the biggest problem. We actually started with 4 hypotheses, and we self-funded the company, and we said, okay, let's see if any of these ideas move the needle on retention and completion rates. And I initially wanted to just go build another adaptive learning platform. My co-founder, Eric, was adamant. He was like, if that's what you want to do, I'm out. He's like, I've seen the impact of our adaptive learning platform in higher ed. We're improving GPAs by 9%, but we're only improving completion rates by 1%. And for me, that was really shocking. So Eric had stayed on post-acquisition, and we got together after my 1-year non-solicit on him ended. And we tried these 4 ideas. Like any good startup story, the first 3 were total failures and didn't move the needle on retention. And the 4th one is the idea that we've built around today, which is, can we help students through the stories of their peers? If we really want to change behavior at scale, what's the most powerful way to do it? And so what we've created is an affinity-based matching engine, which pairs students based on things they have in common: first-generation student, veteran, parent, LGBTQ, whatever those factors are that they match around. We pair them with each other and we say, hey, here's someone else just like you. Lou and you both have this in common. Mark and you have this in common. So the first part is creating that sense of belonging, that people like me thrive at this institution. The second part is letting students know that challenges are normal. This is how we develop a growth mindset, but we do it through peer behavior modeling. We don't have any curriculum. It's all through the peers and the modeling. And now that we got that working, what we realize is we can really help schools listen at scale to their students. So when students start opening up authentically about what they're struggling with, you can listen to them and understand what their needs are. You can understand the sentiment on any given topic. And the last part that we've created is a social nudging engine, which really combines everything together, which is the notion that if you know who a student relates to and you know where she needs your support, then can you direct support at her? But instead of coming in the words of the institution, the support comes from a peer. So let's say you have 1,000 students you're targeting with a message. You want them to register for classes on time, or you want them to join a study group. Instead of sending a message from the institution or from an advisor, we now go search the community for the story most likely to resonate with each individual student. And then we push that story. So that's how we've built our engine. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks. So Lou, over to you.
Mark, thanks. And Matt and everybody, thanks for having us out here today. Much more enjoyable than I thought it was going to be at the start. So thank you. Karan, great lead in. We came at this a little bit differently. Our team was not a team of educators, quite honestly. We were doing some work in financial services with Capital One, who brought us in because they liked the approach that my co-founder and I had taken. My co-founder's an applied mathematician. And our fundamental premise of our company at the time, which has not changed, which is demographics don't dictate the decisions that you make or don't make. We don't make decisions in our journey based upon our gender, our race, our ethnicity, our sexual orientation, or our age. We make them based upon our mindset. Are we growth or fixed mindset? Are we proactive or reactive? Are we technologically savvy or not? Are we self-aware or not? Are we procrastinators or not? That's how we interact with people one-to-one. And we were building an engine in the financial services world that was working with Capital One to create that one-to-one experience through the mobile app, like most of the gray-haired people, including myself, or gray-bearded people on the call, remember when you used to walk into a bank branch and the teller used to know you. And then we approached education because, like most startups, we had an investor who was in education, and they said, you should look over here. And I looked at some of the problems in education, including the fact that, notwithstanding the billions of dollars that had gone into higher ed over the prior 20 years, 4- and 6-year graduation rates had not increased, which was staggering to me. I'm also a pretty simple guy. I'm not an applied mathematician. I probably got a 1 on my AP calculus exam. And truth be told, I left after a half an hour and went water skiing. But what we saw was that churn from a mortgage, churn from a credit card, to me was very similar to churn from an education institution. And if you go back to Daniel Ariely's great book, Predictably Irrational, sometimes dropping out of college is not an irrational decision. And we looked at data as you know, everybody's been talking about it today in terms of the value of data and how to take action against it as an asset. And we wanted to give institutions the opportunity to take action against that data by delivering prescriptive analytics. So moving beyond predictive to how do you take action? And our prescriptive analytics are nudges. And a nudge for us, and I think that nudges, interestingly, Karan and I found out, are actually working together on a mutual client without either of us knowing it. And for us, a nudge is a call to action. It's a meta framework, a call to action. Steve, I need you to do X through a channel, text message, push notification, advisor, email, etc., aligned to the problem that you're encountering and your mindset. A proactive person and an overwhelmed person are going to respond to the need to complete their FAFSA verification forms very differently. And so one size fits all messaging doesn't work at Amazon. It doesn't work at Spotify. It doesn't work at Netflix. Why should it work in education? And so lastly, Mark, I'll just let the other thing, you know, everybody likes to talk about growth or fixed mindset or open or closed minded. We don't view these things are good or bad. They just are. And when you interact with people on a one-to-one basis, you're always looking for responses. Are they nodding? Are they smiling? Are they shaking their head? Are they giving the dog sideways look? You know, that's what the system's designed to do, is take advantage of the cloud and some of the great work that Linda and end-to-end have talked about, and the IMS standards as well, and by taking action against it by leveraging cloud to engage students the way they want to be engaged.
So I'm going to step back and net it out a bit for the next question. But so there's 2 solutions here. Each of them harness analytics as a foundation for engaging constituents, but engaging them in a more personal context, but also a scalable model. I mean, both of your models appear to be scalable to any extent necessary in the institution. So you're driving behavioral outcomes with the relevance of those interactions. So let's get into some unique aspects that you each have that I don't really see in any of the established providers in terms of moving that needle towards an objective or an outcome. So I'm going to start with Karan again. So you build these purposeful groups of these constituents to create a sense of community, to both attract and retain students, and to speak to the scale. So I might put you on the spot a little bit here, but certain sources tell me that you're deployed at both ASU and DeVry, both large, highly demanding, outcome-driven institutions, if there were any. So nothing proprietary I'm going to ask you here, but based on that experience, you know, what can you just net out some of the advantages of the Get Set deployment and the engagement model that you're building and refining?
Yeah. First, a clarification. There are no demanding clients in higher education. I've never heard of such a thing.
Just because they all are, right?
On the spectrum.
Exactly. So I think the way we look at it is, I think this is one of the advantages of being a more mature company now than when we started. When we started, we said, hey, this is what we've built. How would you like to use it? And I think that was the wrong approach in the beginning, and it led to some missteps. Over time, we've gotten a real point of view about how do you deploy this thing? Here's a formula to go about it. There are two key paths to making sure it's successful for you, your staff, and your students. The first path is that schools deploy GetSet in whether it's their admit process, so they've just admitted students and they're trying to help drive yield, keep those students through that entire process, and then through to persistence, or GetSet as part of the first course that students take. So for a lot of online schools, there is a first course that every student takes. For a lot of the more sophisticated traditional schools, they've also realized that a capstone course can be very helpful in making sure that you've got an introduction, like a welcome mat to the university. So whatever that welcome mat is, right, whether it's in the orientation or in a first course, GetSet needs to be an integral part of that. Once we do that, we get students into the app. We all have to be honest with ourselves. While GetSet is a social app, we're never going to compete with Insta or TikTok or Snap. We're not going to replace the things that students use on a day-to-day basis. We're not built to be an addictive app because we don't make money from page views or time on the app. We make money because we help drive better outcomes. And so our focus is, can we quickly get students in? When schools use one of those two paths, they're very quickly able to drive very high adoption. So most schools that use the orientation path have, let's say 80%, 60 to 80% adoption, depending on the model. And then obviously if you've got it as part of a course, you're driving essentially 100% adoption. Once you've got the students in, you start getting those conversations going. Then you start to get the students supporting each other, building friendships. Some of those friendships will go off app. So we're honest with ourselves that we're not going to replace WhatsApp or FaceTime or all the other ways that students can talk to each other. So students do take some of those conversations off app. And that's where the power of the social nudging really begins. And I wanted to build on a point that Lou made, which is, even in GetSet, we've gotten a lot of flack from people that we don't actually ask the school for any demographic data. We have a field when students are creating their account and they just choose which tags they identify with. And those are both demographics and interests, like I want to be better at study skills. I want to be better at time management. And so it's really important. I think a lot of times schools do kind of, and I get where it comes from, right? It comes from like a good place of trying to support your students better, but it's really important to not let demographics be the only destiny you're using for students, because that's a great way to build stereotype threat or to damage your students with imposter syndrome. And it's really important to let students tell you how they want to relate to each other rather than assuming that.
Okay, yeah, and I think, you know, this idea of the social aspects or the EQ around how you use analytics, I think is a really interesting development and fits right in the higher ed context. But so Lou, your solution is more modularized, I would say. So you use behavioral data and AI, and you nudge students towards a targeted outcome. But in your case, that outcome has been predefined by your customer, the institution, and it could be, we want to see more FAFSA completion, we want to see earlier enrollment deposits, and so I think, as you know, again, it's generic in the sense that it doesn't utilize and in fact removes any demographic data related to the profile data that the customer, the institution, provides you. And I can I can think of a number of reasons, and one particular recent example why that would be an advantage. But if you could articulate that a little bit, and I think, you know, why does it work?
Well, it works because it's magic. There you go. You know, it works because we've attempted to figure out why people make decisions, and Mark, we've taken the other approach that because we anonymize all our data, and because we strip out through intentionality all of these aspects of demographics and the like. And by the way, not just demographics, we don't use zip code, right? The other proxies that individuals have used, such as, oh, you're from Compton, that ergo, that must mean something in terms of how you approach the problem. One of our partner customers refers to it as designing with equity. And I would like to say that we approach this with that in mind, but when we launched the company and Vijay was designing the algorithms, it was not around DEI initiatives. It was based upon this premise of how people make decisions and just this fundamental belief that, around how to do that. And so by having a more serious approach to data privacy and pooling all the data, we're not creating data silos. So if we have students at, say, a Johns Hopkins or a DeVry or a large public or a private, all of these things go into the pool, because while every institution likes to think that their students are unique, they're still people. We also pool some of this data with our banking data and our healthcare data as well, so that you now begin to get a much more robust and complete picture of a person, because you can't approach your educational journey without thinking about finances. And then we also look and say, wow, there's all this slate data. Why don't we combine this slate data with D2L data or other LMS data or card swipe data from a student entering a gym or a library, and use those behaviors to indicate these attitudinal dimensions and build that together. So what it starts to do is it starts to create the same type of collaborative filtering recommendation engine that you would see at a Netflix or a Spotify or an Amazon, right? Like that's why they're creating value, is because out of relevance. And Mark, I don't want to have you turn off on me right now. We're creating a form of empathy. You're starting to create that human connection that folks have been driving towards. I think Kelly first mentioned it in terms of culture versus, the university can create this, by the way, for individuals irrespective of age who want this type of engagement through digital channels now. And we have taken the other approach, which is completely opposite, and I'll name them by name because I'm not the most diplomatic individual in the world. EAB. For those that didn't see, EAB was just identified as their engine, which, by the way, does not use any learning management system data to understand student outcomes. Their engine was being used to route students of color who were determined to be at risk solely because of their demographics out of STEM and math majors. Why? They're too hard. Let that sit there for a moment. Now, by the way, go back to this guy for a minute. White Jewish kid from Providence, Rhode Island, who headed off to University of Michigan with his 1 in AP, on his AP calculus exam. They should have routed me out of math majors, right? That dog wasn't going to hunt. And so when you think about somebody like an EAB who takes 6 to 8 months to install and $300,000 a year to deploy, go blue, Adrian, and they don't deliver nudges or even an understanding of the student without taking into account race, and their response to the problem is, well, we'll just take race out of the algorithm. You can't forget your whole strategy around managing data, and is your data being ethically managed? You can't just take your carburetor out of your old engine and say, okay, we're good now. It's not going to be it's a green car, right? So for us, we just have always been talking to folks about using data more intelligently and then letting the results help them guide. And then what's important, to Karan's point, is when we give back our profiles, they get reassembled inside of an LMS, an SIS, or a CRM. And then the school can take action if they so choose, based upon creating communities and creating groups. Like, so for instance, we're actually partnering with Get Set, where some of our mindset-based nudges are being used with some of their affinity-based groups, because, oh, guess what? Everybody in the LGBTQ group doesn't think the same way. Right. So if they're nervous in the LGBT group or capricious in that group, we should talk to them a little bit differently.
Okay. And yeah, and So, I mean, this is I found it compelling. I think a lot of folks in this call are curious, if not compelled, to look into this a little more deeply. But as you noted, a lot of these analytics projects can be big, can be expensive, have long timelines. What you've described sounds complicated, and so I want to get to back to a more practical aspect of this. What I really liked, the more I learned about your solutions, were a couple of factors, and I would say it's around transparency and understanding the road ahead. So it's what you do with customers' data in terms of using it and returning it to them. I think you go a little more on that, and ownership and monetization on that, and then just brief snapshots, like articulate like what does a customer need to provide to get started, and what's like a reasonable or average time range to get this going, deployed and operationalizing and doing what it needs to do. I think that would be an interesting point of a departure. You can get into license models if you want around that, but just those two factors I think are very of the moment right now in this environment.
Does Karan go first again, like you're always letting him go first?
Yeah, let Karan go first. He's younger.
I think at the core, right, we've had a lot of folks talking about technology and platforms today. I think at the core, the first thing the university needs is a person who owns it, a person who has the authority and the ability to clear all obstacles and can make those decisions. Because once a university's bought in that, yes, I want to improve student success through discourse analytics, through GetSet, whatever that thing is that the school is bought in on, there also needs to be a person who owns it. They're the principal person to drive this change at the university. For us, there's really not much change management required at the university, because once the university's made a decision to buy, it's pretty quick to launch, and they've got to choose, are we putting it in our orientation or are we putting it in a course? Some schools have more complexity around putting it in a course where there are individual deans who have to make that call. Other schools that we work with have tried interesting strategies where we have a very large customer that started with a couple of schools. Those schools had substantially better retention after the first year, and they just presented it at the dean's meeting and the other deans got on board, right? So there are different ways to go about it. I think the second part, just thinking about license models, is for any newer or smaller company, right? These can get complicated because schools are used to buying in kind of a box that they're used to. And I think one of the challenges, frankly, in higher ed versus a lot of other industries is value-based pricing is really an unheard of concept, right? So it's kind of like, well, I have this many FTEs, so what's my per FTE amount? And that's challenging, right? Because, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to have a community, and do you want to be able to listen to those students at scale? Do you want to do 5 social nudges a year to students? Do you want to do 30? What's the scale of impact that you want to create? So, just to explain, licensing models starts all the way down at $25,000. And we have our first set of clients reaching the 7-figure mark this year. So it just depends on the scale of the school, number of FTEs, and the amount of nudging they want to do. Lou, over to you.
How fast can you deploy?
2 to 3 months from a thumbs up. I mean, it's 2 to 3 months of elapsed time in terms of actual human time. We just need a single sign-on integration, whether that's through LTI or just a general SSO into their student portal and their orientation. And we need about 2 weeks lead time to get a couple of existing students on the platform to kind of populate it with some stories. So when your new students come into the platform, it doesn't feel empty.
How about you, Lou?
So thanks, Karan, Mark. So first, one of the things that we did was, which helps our speed to deployment, is we're not consultants. So our goal is we're not consultants. What we did was we attempted to create modularized solutions to problems that institutions confront. Improving deposit, improving enrollment, improving FAFSA completion, reducing melt, improving success, improving progression. Standardized data request aligned to a problem, with programmatic nudges that are data objects that reside along with our profiles in our graph database. So all of these things are floating around in the back. So with that being said, and the ability to leverage slate data for learner outcomes, the ability to leverage and vice versa. And so with that approach, we can be deployed much like Karan. It doesn't take us a full 8 weeks depending upon headcount, but once we clear InfoSec review and we get greenlit, we can be up and running in 8 weeks. And then once we get turned on and the data starts flowing, within the first week, we'll have profiles built aligned to nudge strategies. And within 4 weeks of launch, we will have at least one complete cycle with the institution through the nudging of the students with the feedback loop completed, because that's where the ML starts kicking in to start understanding the impact of a nudge on a profile, profiles on a cluster, because we use a think-like clustering algorithm, et cetera. A couple of other points, Mark. We share our algorithms with IR. For our most sophisticated customers and our most curious customers, we will share the algorithm with them. Now, we don't give them the actual weightage of the scoring, but we'll say this data signal has a high, medium, or low weightage, because I don't believe in black boxes. I think the model that, while I appreciate the soil that Civitas and EAB plowed when they launched into this space, I just don't understand why any institution would embrace an algorithm that's a black box, or a company that does not share its algorithm. We pool all the data in an anonymized fashion because that helps our rapid understanding. So it's a give to get model. So we are monetizing the data, but we aren't reselling that data anywhere else. And we are both, from an organizational culture perspective and contractually prohibited for marketing to students outside of whatever the university is. And what's really interesting is, because we give the profiles, the algorithm, and the nudges back to the school, we've seen some of our institutions run with it and start using these data elements that we've created for them in new and different ways that we're not getting paid for, which actually makes me happy, because it shows that by creating new data out of existing data, you're improving processes and driving, and forgive me for not being able to look at my notes at the same time, push some of the business process change that the folks who were talking before us had been bringing up.
Okay.
And ultimately, where we see this really playing in is improving learner outcomes, because we can deliver back to institutions early warning, so that you can think about, this student has an attrition risk, she's vulnerable because of an academic risk, a social risk, a financial risk, or a connected risk, and this is the nudge of that her mindset is. So you've got a risk, a factor, and a mindset. Now you can turn your LMS from being a content delivery engine to a learning engine, and that's where we would ultimately see. And our pricing depend upon size and nature of the difficulty of integrations, whether we're pulling data out of a puddle, a lake, a pond, or whatever we've all been talking about today, depending upon the size and the nature of the deployment. On a student head count, because that's kind of how we evaluate it, we fix a fee that ranges somewhere between $1 and $8 per student at full deployment, because we don't want to benefit from increasing retention. Like, I don't want to come back in and at the end of a year say, guess what? We helped you save 100 more students at $20,000 a year. We need to take a piece of that, because as Karan said, they don't want to do any value-based billing. So we'll just live with a flat fee that they can allocate back towards, and there are no seat licenses. It's all just all you can eat data.
Okay. Well, I think Matt has a question, maybe a few others as we move into the Q&A.
Yeah, and JTH and Fred are going to run that in a second. So just putting on my consulting hat and being at universities and just being, having my floor burns putting in student systems. When you say, hey, we got to get the champion, and we got to get the person that signs off on everything. Higher ed is so consensus driven, right? I mean, struggle. Like we have a few presidents. The ones that we are working with right now, I'll be honest, we're probably very innovative in our consulting styles, and those presidents like what we do. And some other presidents don't, which is totally fine. So I think you got to approach schools that have those type of presidents, right? Those presidents that are saying to us, this is what we need to do, and this is what we are mandating to be done. So CIO, CFOs, whoever you're asking, the registrar, you name the names, right? The reason I put the thumbs up, you were hitting on all the things that everyone's talking about, Lou, as to like the actual value of what you're doing, because it's actually the results of the outcome, right? So I think it's a consensus driven element. And I think that I wanted to ask you, like, do you have schools that just struggle with putting in what you do because they don't have that champion? Like, what is your, because I know there's folks in the audience that are saying, like, even though I have a relationship with that school, that person doesn't have the ability to pull the weight that needs to be done. So
yeah, Matt, not only from an implementation, but obviously from a sales perspective, and I think Karan alluded to this as well. In universities, for the most part, you need something to the tune of 20 to 25 people to say yes and only one to say no, right? Yeah. And yeah, so we've encountered this on deployment. There are some institutions that are data ready, data able, and data willing, right? And that willingness is what's really essential. Some of the institutions that we work with, we have problems keeping up. They've got project managers and they've got scrum masters and they're super sophisticated and they built stuff and they know how to do, and they go and they go and they go and they go. And then there are others where there's a lot of finger pointing, and unfortunately too many people in virtually every industry wake up every day and their first order of business is, what can I do today to not get fired? I know that Jeff's going to be presenting shortly, and Jeff used to be over obviously at Johns Hopkins. They're tough to keep up with. The tech resources that they have are very similar to folks at DeVry and folks at Florida State, that they are just champing to transform. But there are other organizations where folks won't share the data because the data, that's their asset, and they don't want to share it, and they don't want to be they don't want to be shunted to the side. And one of the ways we try to overcome that is to try to teach, whether it's advisors or central IT, we're augmenting your intelligence. We're not trying to replace you. We're going to help make you better. This is where the industry is going to go. So the sooner we can get buy-in, and again, having a provost or a president leaning in behind it, keeping wind in the sails, and giving the carrot or the stick when need be helps tremendously. But it's a process. I'd be lying if I would say it's not. But it's not unique to education.
I've never seen an Ivy or an Ivy Plus like John Hopkins not be as nimble. Like I'm sure they would have been able to go. Jeff could have said this, and it would have happened. So we trust us. We know the incumbents that have the ability to be as nimble. They're not always as nimble.
And then quite honestly, there are some that want to be nimble, but they're just resource constrained, right? And so then you have to help them basically remain agile and hack your way to the solution, and not let perfection be the enemy of
Could you
deployment.
Could you not allow your solution? Could you not saturate or at least help the mid-market HBCUs that have these champion, folks? Can they not be the ones?
Yeah, we're super excited. We're launching this month with our first HBCU at Coppin State here in Baltimore, and
okay, good.
Dr. L is just a phenomenal thought leader in the space around that. We're really fortunate to be partnering with the folks at Anthology, who we have an integration with at that as well, and we're excited to see that one come to life. But I see a huge potential. You know, one of our biggest partners is a group out of Oakland called Beyond 12. And Alex Bernadotte, the CEO who runs that organization, it's a coaching and mentoring organization for first-gen students. And we power all of their nudging for their mentor coaches. So part of it is human, part of it is automated. And we see HBCUs as being just a tremendous opportunity to help improve outcomes for those students and drive more value in the ecosystem as well. So yeah, Matt, that's and there are also, you know, there's resource constraints. Hopefully some of the funding that's going to be coming out of a couple of the recent bills will help minimize that, and that it will be put by these institutions to advancing the cause of improved learner outcomes.
Sounds good. Well, I know we've already went over a little bit, so our 30-minute block, it might be 33 or 34 at this stage, but JTH, I see you're on. Both Lou and Karen, you know, stay on because I think people may ask some questions, and I'll let John and others. I haven't had lunch yet, so I'm going to bail a little bit for a second.
Just turn your video off.
Yeah, that's right.
We'll let you have lunch there, Matt. So one question I had is, you know, you talked about this is for Lou and Karen. You know, you talked about the impact that you know, you were looking at things and there was very little impact in terms of retention and persistence. What impact has your approach had on the numbers? Have you been able to look and say, yeah, this is really moved the needle substantially. We're seeing it's really happening. How have your customers reacted to this?
Go ahead, Karan. I've been talking a lot.
Thanks, Lou. We've conducted a variety of RCTs and all sorts of other approaches. We generate a 300 to 800 basis points, so 3 to 8 percentage point gain in first year completion at pretty much every institution we work with. We've also seen increases in GPA, but the main thing that we're motivated by is completion rates. And, you know, I think just one point to add is I think if higher ed wants to take a lesson from other industries, right, we're encountering a worldwide pandemic right now. If higher ed was taking on this worldwide pandemic, we would be in much worse shape. Because in higher ed, we live in a special snowflake world. Well, my university is different. I'm an SEC school. My students are different. I'm on the West Coast. My students are different. Students are students. And can you imagine in healthcare if people were like, well, have you tested your vaccine in small towns of under 20,000 people in this state? Well, if you haven't, then that vaccine probably doesn't work. But that's literally how K-12 and higher ed operate. And it's mind-boggling that schools don't just say, okay, a bunch of really giant schools with way more sophisticated analytics and data than I have proven that this works over and over again, rather than just sitting there and pontificating about whether it will work for their students. So, you know, coming back to the point that Matt was making, one of my lessons in this being my second company around is just not to waste time on people that need, you know, decades to make a decision. They probably won't exist 2 decades from now as a school because the other schools are eating their lunch and growing way faster. And so we've just been fortunate to focus on people, and there are lots of great schools out there, to focus on people who get it, right? Like if you want to improve student success, you're either going to go do it or you're going to make an excuse why you didn't do it.
And you know, John, to Karan's point, one of the things that resonated deeply with me was when Kelly mentioned, you know, what's going to be the difference between a student taking a course on LinkedIn Learn versus a course at Villanova, right? Like the industry is changing, and it's changing rapidly. Even while COVID almost put us out of business, because from the hierarchy of needs perspective, schools didn't need us yet. One of the things that's been transformative is it's forced institutions to use LMSs in a way that they had never done before. So that has created a new proliferation of data. Slate has grown as well. And our results, so at Beyond 12, you know, for students with 4-year and 6-year persistence rates, we've doubled their success rates with their students. We are always having our institutions do A/B testing. And while my partner hates talking about the amount of lift that we create because he says we're transforming learning, it's not uncommon for us to create increases in persistence and retention rates upwards of 20% within the first semester of work. With one of our schools for enrollment management, we increased yield by reducing summer melt over control by 63% this past fall. And we can increase FAFSA verification completion rates by 23% routinely. And maybe the one that's the best one, we were working with one large public school institution down in Florida, where with one particular cohort of students one term, we moved retention rates from 96.3% for this cohort was the test group, the control, and our group retained at 98.7. Wow. And the big example is there, anybody that's tried to move from a 12 to a 9 handicap knows how hard it is to start improving when you're at that level. So what I think Karan and I are saying is, whether you're doing this through peer focus, whether you're doing this through a pure data focus, like by treating people the way they want to be treated and meeting them where they are and letting the data drive that, you're gonna drive incredible lift in a repeatable, scalable manner. And that's what the systems are designed to do.
Well, Mo, you know, it's interesting to listen to both of you talk about a very different approach to this, because everything that I've always seen has been very demographic heavy. And, you know, if you looked at my demographic, you know, you would expect a certain set of thought and outcomes from me than you would actually get if you met me as a person. And it just seems that, you know, I keep resonating with the Jack Welch quote about, if change outside the organization is happening faster than inside, the end is near. And it just feels like that higher ed is still very grasped onto the old way of doing things and the old definitions of student success. Are you having trouble breaking through those old definitions of student success, or even getting them to define what student success is?
I saw a really interesting, 2 articles came up the other day that were really interesting. One was, I think one was by Edge Ventures and the other one was in Inside Higher Ed. And one talked about how CEOs are looking for students who have better skills coming out of school. Mm-hmm. And the other one was how CEOs were looking for students who have more critical thinking. The articles couldn't be more different, right? And what's the value of a liberal arts education versus the value of a STEM education? I think the industry, thankfully, is in flux. Institutions are now finally willing to admit that their students are consumers. 4 years ago, when I told an institution that our system was adapted from our work in financial aid, they basically kicked me off the call because they said, well, education and banking are 2 very different industries, so your algorithm won't apply. By the way, we're working at that school now, and those guys are no longer running the informatics department. I think Karan nailed it, right? I think that what is student success? We work with one organization where they define success as when their graduates, this is a mentoring organization, when their graduates become SVPs in Fortune 1000 companies, that's success. Success at Florida State is viewed somewhat differently maybe than Johns Hopkins, but I think at the end of the day, that's an evolving term. And I think that's an evolving term that's going to have different meanings at different places even. And I think people are trying to resolve for that. And, you know, to go with your Jack Welch quote, if we like to do the Henry Ford quote, which is, if I had listened to my customers, I would have been breeding faster horses. And, you know, and so I think for educational institutions to survive and succeed in the upcoming next decade, they're going to have to redefine success and then go back and look at how they're using their data to create better experiences that meet each one of their students where they are.
So one of the questions is, and that's a great point in terms of redefining the data. One of the questions that came up earlier in the earlier session was, you know, how do you envision changes in terms of the data the data architecture and the data that's captured, I mean, you're asking for some data here that most schools, I'm not sure, even get.
Oh, I mean, they may not understand it, but they're capturing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's there. Yeah, you know, it card swipe data into gymnasiums is there. Attendance in a library and jumping onto a Wi-Fi, your LMSs, your e-readers, your SISs, you know, that data is captured. Now, does it all roll into a system like a Salesforce CRM or an Anthology? Does it reside in the cloud? I don't know. That's going to depend upon the degree of sophistication of the data architects and the CIOs. But the data that we need, especially now with you know, when you think about Teams usage and Kaltura and LMSs, it's all there. Now, everybody uses it a little differently. So that doesn't, like, they're all not on the same standards, unfortunately. And they all maybe have different names for their fields. And part of the, you know, the great news is like, you think about somebody like FSU and somebody like Johns Hopkins and somebody in DeVry, super sophisticated dev shops. I just wish they would all use the same fields and the same terminology, and they don't. You know, that's why Microsoft and Salesforce are all trying to come up with their higher education data model and things like that. But that's the thing that, you know, John, is that the data's there. This isn't about creating new data. I don't know, Karan, if you feel differently, but it's there.
Well, we don't even ask the school for any data. It's just single sign-on, first name, last name, school ID, that's it. We generate a lot of data for the school. Like, how does your student feel? What are they thinking? What's trending in your community? But we don't actually ask for anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I like the, Monique posted something in the chat that I really like, and I'm just going to throw it out there, is, persistence takes the student's perspective of success, whereas retention takes the institution's perspective of success.
You know, there's a guy who I've gotten to know. Anybody who spends time in the Microsoft ecosystem has probably seen David Kellerman, who teaches mechanical engineering down at the University of New South Wales. And I think what you're starting to see is he has a really interesting view of what it means to be student-centric, right? Like this whole concept of institutions of higher learning where instructors get tenure based upon the articles that they publish or the amount of R1 grants that they receive. Well, forgive me, how the fuck does that help a student? Are you allowed to say that, Matt? I'm sorry.
No, you're not.
Now we have an R rating, Lou. Thank you. Now I can't even put this on the web.
Okay, I thought we were on a cable network, and I was, so I didn't know. But how does that help a student learn, John? Like, I'm just curious. And so where we're trying to push for is, as you start rethinking student progression from high school to 2-year to 4-year with certification and micro-credentialing and all these other aspects that are starting to enter into the lexicon, I think institutions are starting to really learn. My son is a freshman, just finished his freshman year in college. And I was driving him back in January, and he said, "Oh yeah, Dad, my school nudges me all the time." All the time, he said. But the nudges absolutely suck. I taught him his English skills. And I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because they have no rational relationship to anything that I'm doing as a student."
Interesting.
So that becomes really important to think about, because why do 200 million people in the world pay for Amazon Prime? 200 million. Amazon does $22 billion a year just in subscription revenue for something that allows us to have something delivered in a day, because they create value. So as soon as you start getting institutions creating value for students, you're going to change what it means to be an institution of higher learning rather than an institution of higher education.
So that's, go ahead, Karan.
I was going to add one thing to what Lou said is, I think at the very top level of the institution has to think about whether it has become the boy who cried wolf, whether the amount of messages and communication going to students is so overwhelming that students have completely tuned out. So the students that needed your support that needed that nudge or that direction or that support aren't getting it anymore because they got 32 emails from housing and they got 15 emails from the provost's office, 17 emails from their dean, and that's before noon.
Yeah.
But that's because they don't see it. They're so siloed. They don't even understand that, yeah, 3 other people sent, like there's no communication. I'll be honest, we should probably just do a room, like just a Friday, and we just invite people to come and talk about this. Because you guys have touched on like 5 or 6 different things. That I think if we just created a room, we could do it on Zoom somewhere or some.
Or Clubhouse, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they don't know, actually. The question is, in a lot of cases, they just don't care. This, you know, this is my defined channel and I'm going to fill it.
Mhm.
And this person is going to somehow sort through it. And like a lot of people, when it reaches the level of noise, they start tuning it out. And by the way, Lou, I was on a call with Paul LeBlanc the other day, and he dropped an F-bomb. So I think you're in good company there. So what's next for you guys? I mean, so there's great stuff going on. I think as we shift towards the real meat of the question, and that is, how do we enable learners to learn more effectively, given their mindset, the state of where they are in their path, be they traditional, non-traditional, getting retrained, et cetera. I mean, is that something that's on your radars to the point where you're, you know, starting to think about, if not expend R&D on solving that problem?
I'll take a first stab at that. So for us, an interesting thing's happened over the last 12 months is we've seen a tremendous amount of growth. It's new for us, so we're still developing it. We have an unannounced partnership with a national pharmacy chain where we're helping onboard new employees. So it's taking the same logic around, you're bringing in entry-level hires and you want them to thrive and persist in your organization. Especially if you're making new hires during a pandemic where people aren't seeing each other face to face, and how do you create that company culture? And what's interesting is, as we started entering that space with employers, the employers are saying, well, you have hundreds of thousands of college students on your platforms. Are there ways for us to connect with those students and let them connect with our hires, right? And this can apply in a variety of ways. It can be a DEI perspective. It can be in all sorts of different approaches. But the idea is, can the employers say, well, if we're using this platform for retention to connect people based on what's relevant to them, can we allow students who are interested in a career path at our firm to start connecting earlier? It's not a sell, right? It's just connect. And if you think about this, this really applies across the spectrum. I think I think if we think of like the OPM landscape, for example, there's a lot of selling. There's a lot of, well, I just got this prospect. Now who's the fastest to dial them? And I think the changing behavior of consumers is, we don't want to be sold in the way we used to be. We're overwhelmed by the noise of selling. We want to discover and warm up on our own before we make that next step.
The only guy who I like listening to talk more than myself is listening to Karan. So thanks, Karan. Yeah. So Mark, yeah. So we've had a very similar experience as Karan has had, except where we're seeing and where we've started to move into is down into K through 12, which I had always wanted to stay away from because having been a father of 4, I didn't want to get involved in the brain development aspects of impact of puberty and the like on evolving brain. But picking up and really starting nudging earlier in the journey and understanding mindsets starts to unlock a whole lot of potential for lifelong learning. We're doing some really exciting work in the state of Maryland with Microsoft and Boys and Girls Clubs of Baltimore around workforce enablement. And we're also doing some work around reskilling and upskilling as well in the corporate space, where you think about corporate training and how to guide students, learners through progression more effectively. So it really has become more of a cradle to gray, I think is the most current term of the week. We see ourselves as being a platform that can plug in as an insights layer into almost any CRM driven environment to drive lifelong learning. And ideally and potentially down the road, we see, if you start thinking of learners taking agency about their journey, is our government's going to start enabling data agency. And so, are people going to be able to unlock, say, their data USB that they can take from high school and give it to their college and help that improve outcomes down the road. And so we're a journey company. We support the journey, and we hope to drive outcomes across every facet of where lifelong learning can occur, from elementary and middle school all the way through, you're working with organizations to help keep their workers skilled and governments to help keep their populations employed.
I love that term, a journey company, because I really think that we're coming to the point we need to think about education as sort of K through,
Yeah, and the best thing, John, is I literally just made that up.
Take it on your feet.
So really quick, we're at the top of the hour. I think, is Curtis in the house?
Yeah, and Lou, part of my question was in the context of the next discussion,
Anita?
which is how do you understand the efficacy and work in context with the teaching and learning systems, given that there's challenges there, new ways of thinking, and questions about the value of some of the current systems deployed.
So really quick, as we transition, I see I would say she's like a mentor to me. She probably taught me everything in records. Monique, are you around? Or you just give me support by being virtual? Let's see if she's around.
I am around, Matt.
Well, look at that. All the things that I designed wrong, she didn't teach me that. I learned all the right things from her. So Monique is the one that took me into that law school that I always talk about. Monique, welcome. I love to see you there.
Yeah, I'm camera shy today, so I'm gonna keep my cameras off.
Okay.
But I am here, and I'm enjoying this is a really very, very good discussion. And as you know, I'm very much involved with student engagement and how to, increase retention and persistence. And I am an IS person also. So this is really up my alley, and I've learned a lot. So thank you again for inviting me, and hopefully I will connect with some of your speakers today, because I am sure my university will be very much interested in learning about their products.
That's great. And Monique, we should maybe get lunch, right? So we're in Chicago. My office is right in Chicago. So I'm gonna turn over. So Monique, me and you can dialogue on the side. I'll let Mark and Curtis and Anita take the show. I will put the Quiller out there, and we're off and running. Lou and Karen, maybe we should connect, because I think we have a lot of things in common that we're doing in market. We'll speak soon.